Pablo Escobar was 12 years old when he made his first real money from crime. But this wasn't a child stealing candy or skipping school. This was a boy who had figured out how to turn death into profit. In the graveyards of Medellín, Pablo had discovered that families would pay almost anything to have the headstones of their loved ones cleaned and polished. What they didn't know was that Pablo was also stealing those same headstones, sandblasting off the inscriptions, and selling them to other funeral homes across the city. By the time anyone noticed, Pablo Escobar had learned the most important lesson of his life. There was no crime too small if you thought big enough. And in the next 15 years, this lesson would help him build an empire that would challenge the United States government itself. But to understand how a 12-year-old headstone thief became the most wanted man in the world, you have to understand that Pablo Escobar wasn't born a criminal. He was created by a family that taught him that rules were suggestions, that authority was negotiable, and that the only sin was getting caught. This is the story of how a Colombian child learned to see opportunity where others saw tragedy, profit where others saw loss, and power where others saw only chaos. Pablo de Jesus Escobar. Echeverry worked as a farmer and occasionally as a watchman. He was the kind of man who understood that survival in Colombia meant being practical about morality. Abel taught his children that the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who took what they wanted and those who waited for permission. Pablo was listening. Hermilda Gaviria was different. She was ambitious in a way that made her neighbors uncomfortable. Hermilda believed that her family was destined for something greater than the small-town life of Rio Negro. She filled Pablo's head with dreams of wealth, power, and respect, but she never told him how to achieve these things legally. The family dynamic was crucial to understanding Pablo's development. Abel represented practical criminality, the idea that breaking small laws was acceptable if it helped you survive. Hermilda represented unlimited ambition, the belief that her son was special enough to deserve anything he wanted. Between these two influences, Pablo learned that he was both entitled to success and justified in using any means necessary to achieve it. Hermilda's influence on Pablo cannot be overstated. She treated him as the favored child from an early age, constantly praising his intelligence, his initiative, his potential for greatness. When Pablo brought home money from his criminal enterprises, Hermilda didn't ask where it came from. She celebrated his success and encouraged him to think even bigger. Hermilda was inadvertently teaching Pablo that maternal approval was tied to his ability to generate wealth, regardless of the methods he used. The family wasn't poor, but they lived in the uncomfortable space between poverty and prosperity, where small compromises seemed reasonable and larger compromises seemed inevitable. Pablo learned that his parents' happiness was directly connected to the family's economic status, and that he had the power to influence that status through his criminal activities. This gave him a sense of responsibility and importance that most children never experience, but it also convinced him that crime was not just acceptable but necessary for family loyalty. Pablo's siblings would later describe the household as one where Pablo's activities were never questioned, as long as they were successful. Failure was criticized, but success was celebrated regardless of how it was achieved. This created an environment where Pablo learned that results mattered more than methods, that efficiency was more important than morality, and that family approval could excuse almost any behavior. The Escobar family wasn't poor, but they weren't rich either. They lived in the space between desperation and comfort, where small compromises with the law seemed reasonable, where bending rules felt like survival rather than crime. Pablo learned early that his mother's approval came when he brought home money, regardless of how he had earned it. His father's respect came when he showed initiative, regardless of whether that initiative was legal. When Pablo was 7 years old, the family moved to Medellín. For most children, this would have been a traumatic uprooting. For Pablo, it was an education in opportunity. The city was bigger, more complex, full of systems that could be exploited by someone smart enough to understand them, and Pablo understood them very quickly. In school, Pablo was neither the smartest student nor the most popular, but he was the most observant. While other children played games, Pablo watched patterns. He noticed which teachers could be flattered, which classmates could be intimidated, which rules were enforced, and which were ignored. He learned that power in any system belonged to whoever understood that system better than anyone else. But this wasn't just cleverness. This was calculation. Pablo's teachers would later remember him as polite, well-dressed, and unusually mature for his age. What they didn't understand was that Pablo was studying them as carefully as they were trying to teach him. He learned that authority figures were just people with weaknesses, insecurities, and needs that could be exploited. When Pablo wanted better grades, he didn't study harder. He figured out what each teacher wanted to hear, what would make them feel important, what would convince them that Pablo was the kind of student who deserved special treatment. The other children sensed something different about Pablo, though they couldn't articulate what it was. He had a way of making himself the center of attention without seeming to try. When Pablo told stories, people listened. When Pablo suggested games, people played them. When Pablo decided someone was an enemy, that person would find themselves isolated, mocked, excluded from the group. Pablo was learning to manipulate social dynamics with a precision that most adults never achieved. But Pablo's real education was happening outside the classroom. On the streets of Medellín, he was learning lessons that would shape his understanding of power, loyalty, and fear for the rest of his life. He watched how the older criminals operated, how they recruited younger boys, how they maintained discipline within their organizations. Pablo saw that the most successful criminals weren't necessarily the most violent or the most intelligent. They were the ones who understood human psychology better than their competitors. By age 10, Pablo had organized his first business venture. He convinced other children to collect bottle caps, promising them that the caps could be traded for small toys. Pablo collected thousands of bottle caps this way, but he never had any toys to trade. Instead, he sold the bottle caps to a recycling center for actual money. When the other children complained, Pablo simply moved to a different neighborhood and started the operation again. He had discovered the fundamental principle that would guide his entire life. If people were stupid enough to trust you, that was their problem, not yours. The headstone business was more sophisticated. Pablo had realized that grief made people careless with money and that most people never visited graveyards more than once or twice a year. He would scope out fresh graves, note which headstones were expensive, and then return weeks later to carefully remove them. His sandblasting operation was hidden in an abandoned building near the cemetery. Pablo would strip away the old inscriptions and sell the clean headstones to funeral homes that were too busy or too greedy to ask questions about where he had gotten them. But the operation revealed something darker about Pablo's psychology than simple greed. Other children his age were afraid of graveyards, especially at night. Pablo felt perfectly comfortable there. He later told people that he found cemeteries peaceful, that death didn't frighten him because dead people couldn't hurt you. The living were the ones you had to worry about. This comfort with death would become one of Pablo's most distinctive characteristics. While his competitors were squeamish about violence, Pablo saw it as just another business tool. The headstone operation also demonstrated Pablo's understanding of market dynamics that would serve him throughout his criminal career. He had identified an underserved market, funeral homes that needed inventory quickly and cheaply. He had found a source of raw materials that no one else was monitoring, graves that families visited infrequently. He had solved the manufacturing challenge by learning to operate sandblasting equipment that adults twice his age couldn't handle, and he had created a distribution system that minimized his risk while maximizing his profit. Most importantly, Pablo had learned to think systematically about crime. This wasn't a child stealing candy on impulse. This was a young entrepreneur who had analyzed every aspect of his business model, identified potential risks, and developed contingency plans. When cemetery workers started paying more attention to the graveyards, Pablo shifted his operations to different cemeteries. When one funeral home started asking too many questions, Pablo found new customers. He was treating crime like a legitimate business problem that required intelligent solutions. What made this operation remarkable wasn't the profit, though Pablo was making more money than most adults in his neighborhood. What made it remarkable was the psychological sophistication. Pablo had identified a market inefficiency, developed a supply chain, created a distribution network, and established security protocols to avoid detection. He was 12 years old, and he felt no guilt whatsoever about desecrating graves because he had already learned to think of other people's emotions as business opportunities. When the headstone operation was finally discovered, Pablo's parents were called to a meeting with school officials and a local priest. Everyone expected punishment, apologies, and promises that this behavior would never happen again. Instead, Pablo sat quietly while the adults discussed his crime and then asked a single question: if the headstones were just sitting in the ground doing nothing, and families never visited anyway, who exactly was he hurting? The adults had no good answer. Pablo had learned that moral authority could be questioned, that guilt was a choice, and that the right question could make almost any behavior seem reasonable. But he was just getting started. The headstone scandal should have been a warning to everyone who knew Pablo Escobar. Instead, it became a local legend. Neighbors began telling stories about the clever boy who had figured out how to make money from death. They laughed about his ingenuity, his boldness, his entrepreneurial spirit. No one seemed to understand that they were celebrating the birth of something dangerous. Pablo understood perfectly. He was learning that people admired successful criminals as long as the victims were strangers. This was the beginning of Pablo's real education and power. Not the power that came from being stronger or faster or smarter than other people, but the power that came from being willing to do things that other people wouldn't do. Pablo discovered that most people had invisible lines they wouldn't cross, moral boundaries that limited their options. Pablo had no such boundaries. This made him more dangerous than anyone realized, including Pablo himself, and he was about to prove it. As Pablo entered his teenage years, his crimes became more ambitious and more violent. He graduated from stealing headstones to stealing cars, from cheating school children to robbing pedestrians. But the pattern was always the same. Pablo would identify a weakness in the system, exploit that weakness systematically, and then move on to bigger targets before anyone could stop him. He was developing the methodology that would eventually make him the most powerful criminal in history. By age 15, Pablo had assembled his first crew. These weren't friends in any normal sense of the word. They were tools, carefully selected for specific functions. Some were good at violence, others at lying, others at charming victims. Pablo understood that loyalty could be purchased, but it had to be purchased correctly. Too little money, and people would betray you. Too much money, and people would become lazy. Pablo found the exact price point where his crew would do anything he asked without thinking they deserved equality. The recruitment process revealed Pablo's sophisticated understanding of human psychology. He didn't recruit the toughest kids or the smartest kids. He recruited the most desperate kids, the ones who had something to prove or something to hide. Pablo understood that desperate people made the most loyal followers because they had the most to lose if they betrayed him. He would study potential recruits for weeks, learning about their families, their fears, their dreams. When Pablo made his recruitment pitch, he knew exactly which buttons to push. The crew had rules that Pablo enforced with a combination of generosity and fear that would become his signature management style. Members who followed orders received money, protection, and respect. Members who questioned orders received warnings. Members who disobeyed orders received punishment that was swift, public, and memorable. Pablo was learning that effective leadership required both the carrot and the stick, but the stick had to be sharp enough that most people never wanted to test it. Pablo's crew operated with a level of sophistication that impressed even experienced criminals in Medellín. They had codes for communication, predetermined meeting points that changed regularly, and protocols for what to do if someone was arrested. Pablo insisted on redundancy in every operation. If one plan failed, there were always backup plans. If one crew member was captured, the others knew how to continue without him. Pablo was developing the organizational skills that would eventually allow him to manage thousands of people across multiple countries. The operations became more sophisticated. Pablo's crew would steal cars in one neighborhood, modify them in another neighborhood, and sell them in a third neighborhood. They developed coded communication systems, established safe houses, and created fake identities. Pablo was building the infrastructure of a criminal organization before he was old enough to vote, but he was also building something else, a reputation for ruthlessness that would follow him for the rest of his life. The car theft operation revealed Pablo's genius for logistics and his understanding of how to minimize risk while maximizing profit. Most car thieves operated impulsively, stealing whatever vehicles they happened to encounter and trying to sell them as quickly as possible. Pablo approached car theft like a manufacturing business. He would spend weeks studying patterns, which neighborhoods had the most valuable cars, which times of day offered the best opportunities, which modification techniques would make stolen vehicles unrecognizable. Pablo established a network of mechanics who specialized in altering stolen cars so completely that even the original owners wouldn't recognize them. License plates were changed, of course, but Pablo went much further. Paint jobs, interior modifications, even engine swaps were routine. Some stolen cars were chopped up for parts that were sold separately. Others were modified so extensively that they became essentially new vehicles with no traceable connection to their original identities. The distribution network was equally sophisticated. Pablo cultivated relationships with used car dealers who operated in gray areas of legality, mechanics who didn't ask questions about paperwork, and customers who cared more about getting a good deal than about the provenance of their purchase. Pablo was learning to build business relationships based on mutual benefit rather than mutual trust. Everyone in the network profited, which meant everyone had an incentive to protect the operation. But the most important aspect of the car theft operation wasn't financial. It was educational. Pablo was learning how to manage complex operations with multiple moving parts, how to coordinate activities across different locations, and how to maintain security while still allowing for efficient communication. These skills would become essential when Pablo eventually scaled up to international drug trafficking operations that required coordination across multiple countries. One incident from this period reveals everything about Pablo's psychology. A member of his crew had been caught stealing a bicycle and had given Pablo's name to the police. When Pablo found out, he didn't just kick the boy out of his crew. He orchestrated an elaborate revenge that destroyed the boy's relationships with his family, got him expelled from school, and eventually forced him to leave Medellín entirely. Pablo spent months planning this revenge, spending more time and energy on it than the original crime had been worth. This wasn't about money or even justice. This was about teaching a lesson that would be remembered by everyone who knew the story. The revenge operation demonstrated Pablo's understanding of psychological warfare that would later become one of his most feared capabilities. Pablo didn't just want to punish the traitor, he wanted to destroy him so completely that other potential traitors would understand the consequences of betrayal. Pablo spread rumors about the boy's family, arranged for him to be caught in compromising situations, and systematically turned his friends against him. By the time Pablo was finished, the boy had lost everything that mattered to him. What made this revenge particularly chilling was Pablo's patience and attention to detail. Most teenagers would have responded with immediate violence or simple exclusion. Pablo crafted a months-long campaign that required him to think several steps ahead, anticipate the target's responses, and coordinate activities among multiple people who weren't even aware they were part of a larger plan. Pablo was learning to think strategically about human destruction in a way that most adults never achieve. The incident also revealed Pablo's understanding that reputation was more valuable than immediate satisfaction. The time and resources Pablo invested in this revenge operation paid dividends for years afterward. Members of his crew understood that betraying Pablo would result in consequences that extended far beyond any immediate punishment. This reputation for elaborate, patient revenge would eventually become one of Pablo's most effective tools for maintaining loyalty and discouraging opposition. But perhaps most importantly, the revenge operation demonstrated Pablo's complete lack of proportionality when it came to perceived threats to his authority. A minor betrayal had resulted in total destruction. This pattern would repeat throughout Pablo's life, eventually escalating to the point where minor slights against Pablo would result in massacres, bombings, and terrorism that would traumatize entire nations. The lesson was simple. Betraying Pablo Escobar was more dangerous than betraying anyone else, because Pablo would make the consequences last longer and hurt more than anyone else would. Even as a teenager, Pablo understood that fear was more valuable than money because fear was renewable. You could spend money only once, but you could use fear forever, and Pablo was building a reputation that would one day terrify nations. American law enforcement in the 1960s had no idea that a teenager in Medellín was developing techniques that would eventually challenge their most basic assumptions about fighting crime. Pablo was learning to think like a corporation while acting like a terrorist, to plan like a general while operating like a businessman. He was combining skills that most criminals never learned and most businessmen never needed, and he was doing all of this before he was old enough to legally buy alcohol in the United States. The techniques Pablo was developing would eventually force American law enforcement to completely rethink their approach to organized crime. Traditional investigations focused on individual criminals who committed specific crimes in specific locations. Pablo was learning to build organizations that could commit multiple crimes simultaneously across multiple locations, with layers of insulation that made it nearly impossible to connect the leadership to the actual criminal acts. Pablo was also developing an understanding of corruption that would eventually prove devastatingly effective against American institutions. Most American law enforcement officers in the 1960s believed that corruption was a problem that existed in other countries, among other kinds of people. They couldn't conceive that American officials could be systematically compromised by foreign criminals with enough money and enough patience to identify every weakness in the system. The psychological techniques Pablo was mastering in the barrios of Medellín would eventually be deployed against DEA agents, federal prosecutors, and even elected officials in the United States. Pablo was learning that everyone had a price, but that price wasn't always money. Some people wanted respect, others wanted revenge against their enemies, still others wanted to feel important or powerful or loved. Pablo was becoming an expert at identifying what people needed psychologically and then providing it in exchange for cooperation. But perhaps most importantly, Pablo was learning to think strategically about violence in a way that would later terrorize two nations. Most criminals used violence reactively as a response to immediate threats or problems. Pablo was learning to use violence proactively as a tool for shaping behavior, controlling information, and building reputation. Violence, properly applied, could eliminate problems before they developed and deter challenges before they materialized. The psychological profile that emerges from Pablo's childhood is unlike anything that American criminologists had studied before. Most criminals were driven by immediate needs: hunger, addiction, desperation, rage. Pablo was driven by abstract concepts: power, respect, legacy, immortality. He wasn't committing crimes to solve problems. He was committing crimes to become someone that problems couldn't touch. By 1967, when Pablo was 18 years old, he had already mastered the fundamental skills that would make him one of the most dangerous men in the world. He could inspire loyalty in people who had every reason to fear him. He could identify weaknesses in systems that their creators thought were secure. He could plan operations that achieved multiple objectives simultaneously. And most importantly, he could convince himself that any action was justified if it served his ultimate goal of becoming untouchable. But Pablo's childhood crimes were just the foundation for something much larger. The headstone thievery had taught him that death was profitable. The car theft operation had taught him that stolen goods could be transformed into legitimate assets. The crew management had taught him that violence was a tool for building loyalty. All of these lessons would be essential when Pablo discovered the product that would make him the richest criminal in history. But this wasn't just about money. This was about proving that a boy from Rio Negro could build an empire that governments couldn't destroy. What made Pablo Escobar different from every other criminal wasn't his intelligence, though he was intelligent. It wasn't his ambition, though he was ambitious. It wasn't his ruthlessness, though he was ruthless. What made Pablo different was his understanding that crime could be scaled infinitely as long as you treated it like a legitimate business. He had learned this lesson by the time he was 15 years old. The rest of the world would spend the next 20 years trying to understand what he already knew. The child who had stolen headstones from graveyards was preparing to steal something much more valuable, the assumption that governments were more powerful than criminals. Pablo's childhood had taught him that every system could be beaten, every authority could be bought, and every rule could be broken if you understood the real rules that governed human behavior. The only question was how big he was willing to think. Pablo's teenage years were ending, but his education was just beginning. He had mastered crime on a local level. Now he needed to learn how to master it on a national level, and eventually on an international level that would bring him into direct conflict with the most powerful country in the world. The headstone thief was about to become a global threat. By 1968, Pablo Escobar had developed all the skills he would need to build one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history. He understood psychology, logistics, leadership, and strategic planning. He had proven his ability to recruit followers, manage complex operations, and eliminate threats. He had learned to think like a businessman while acting like a warlord, but he hadn't yet found the product that would make him the richest criminal who ever lived. That product was closer than anyone realized. In the mountains of Colombia, farmers were beginning to experiment with a plant that would soon transform the global drug trade. In the United States, cultural changes were creating a massive new market for illegal substances. And in Medellín, a young man who had spent his entire life learning how to turn chaos into profit was about to discover the opportunity that would make him more powerful than governments. The techniques Pablo had developed as a teenager stealing cars and headstones would soon be applied to smuggling cocaine into the United States on a scale that no one had ever imagined. The psychological insights he had gained from manipulating schoolmates and crew members would be used to corrupt officials, terrorize enemies, and build loyalty among thousands of followers. The strategic thinking he had demonstrated in planning elaborate revenge operations would be deployed in a war against two of the most powerful governments in the world. But none of this was inevitable. Even in 1968, Pablo could have chosen a different path. He was intelligent enough for legitimate success, charismatic enough for political leadership, and strategic enough for military command. The tragedy of Pablo Escobar isn't that he was born evil. The tragedy is that he was born brilliant, and he chose to use that brilliance to become the most dangerous criminal in history. And in our next episode, we'll see how Pablo took his first steps toward building an empire that would terrify two nations and redefine the meaning of organized crime. We'll explore how Pablo discovered the product that would make him wealthy beyond imagination and more feared than any criminal who had ever lived. Subscribe now, because what happens next will show you how a teenage car thief becomes the man who would eventually declare war on the United States of America.